discuss politics and current events. And we have a segment that we've been doing for quite a while called Daily Distractions, and it's kind of taken on multiple meanings within the show. It was originally meant to sort of lampoon or give our sort of take on some of the sort of strange spin that the media has on certain stories, but with the advent of COVID-19 and also with the current unrest that's going on, it's kind of taken on a different meaning. And sometimes we just want to kind of distract you for a little bit and take you away to a story that's maybe a little bit more positive, a little bit more zany, those kinds of things. So today, I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about SpaceX. And of course, what everybody has been talking about regarding SpaceX is the historic launch of the latest spacecraft to the International Space Station. But there's another story with SpaceX, and this is from CNBC, and the headline reads, Elon Musk tells SpaceX employees that its Starship rocket is the top priority now. It's kind of interesting because the mission to the International Space Station hasn't been completed yet. In other words, although the astronauts have gone up to the space station, they haven't come back down. So you can't call it a successful mission quite yet. Those astronauts still have to safely return to the Earth. And yet, Elon Musk is telling his employees that Starship is actually the new priority of SpaceX at this moment, which I thought was really, really interesting. And I'm not sure if you know much about the Starship program, Pete. Have you heard much about it?
I've read a little bit about it, that the ultimate goal is to get to Mars, that they're planning their first launch for 2022 and to get people, I think their goal is to get people to Mars, or to at least launch people towards Mars by 2024. That seems extremely ambitious. Is that what you've heard?
Yes. And so the key way, that the top takeaways of this particular article say SpaceX is about a week past launching astronauts for the first time, but CEO Elon Musk wants employees to focus on developing the company's next generation rocket. The company's Starship rocket aims to be fully reusable and launch as many as 100 people at a time on missions to the moon and Mars. It says, but the Starship development program has suffered several dramatic setbacks, and Musk in the email declared, quote, the top SpaceX priority, which again, it's kind of interesting. Now, there is a caveat in this article that Elon Musk said, hey, we still got to get these astronauts back home that are on the International Space Station. That is in this article as well. But it is interesting because, there's an old saying, right? Don't count your chickens before they hatch, which, and this is kind of a perfect case of that because, again, the American astronauts, the NASA astronauts that are on the International Space Station, they haven't come back yet. We had a great successful launch. They successfully docked with the International Space Station. They're on the International Space Station right now, but they have not returned. But Elon Musk is pushing for basically another project. This is the prototype. This is the mock-up for Starship. Gosh, it really looks like classic Buck Rogers, doesn't it, Pete? I mean, just 100%, doesn't it?
Yeah, I thought that too. It looked like very much like a 1950s idea of what a spaceship would look like, which is so cool. Now, one of the components, though, you said, okay, they docked, they're on the space station. Now, one of the components of I guess it was the Dragon rocket, landed vertically already.
Yes, so the Dragon, it's the Dragon 9, right? It's called the Dragon 9 because it has 9 engines. And that is a partially reusable rocket. So the main booster, the largest booster part of it actually does come back to the Earth, and it lands like those old Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers serials or old Twilight Zone episodes. It lands, on the ground, vertically using the booster rocket to slow its descent. And again, it's very classic Buck Rogers, very much like classic Flash Gordon. And Starship aims to be 100% reusable so that the entire module can land and I assume lift off again, that kind of a thing, because you would kind of have that kind of a need in any kind of mass colonization project. I mean, we're talking about 100 passengers potentially at a time. That's the capability that they're looking at with this particular project. It really does sound like science fiction, but with what Elon Musk has actually accomplished, you wonder, is this really possible? Is this really going to happen? Are they really going to be able to do this?
Now, my question: if they're going to go to Mars, and you said it could carry 100 people, does that mean that this spaceship will also come back from Mars? Or I can't imagine they're planning to just colonize Mars.
Well, they are planning to colonize Mars. Elon Musk has actually been on record numerous times saying that he believes that humanity needs to be a multi-planet species, that we shouldn't be confined to one planet. He, like a lot of people, including myself, believe strongly that the possibility of humanity being wiped out by an asteroid is a real threat. It's a real possibility. We don't know how soon something like that could happen, but that's kind of the push behind people who think that way, is that's why we need to have colonies on other planets, because the possibility of our own planet being devastated or wiped out by an asteroid, it's a real possibility. That it's something that could happen.
Okay, but we're talking in 2024. That would be the first launch. So you're telling me that the first launch, we're basically re-experiencing Jamestown. This is like Captain John Smith going to Jamestown the first time anybody goes. I mean, Christopher Columbus was 1492. It took a long time for the Spanish and then the English to get, to make permanent colonies in the New World. But you think that the very first voyage, they're going to try to colonize, put people on Mars, and it's going to be like Matt Damon in The Martian. They're going to start farming potatoes there on Mars.
No, I don't believe that's the plan. I think that the plan initially is to go to the moon and look at the possibility of colonizing the moon. And then I think the first mission to Mars, of course, would be more of an exploratory mission. It wouldn't be 100 colonists that plan to stay there. It would be more of an exploratory mission where, yes, indeed, they plan to come back. But the ultimate plan, I think, is to stay. And they would probably use the ship itself as a habitat. So you could potentially see sort of a one-way mission in the future, not necessarily the near future, but in the not so distant future, if this works. Now that they haven't got Starship to work yet, they've had a prototype that they've used called Starhopper that's listed here. They did a flight test in August, fairly recently, with Starhopper, but they haven't tested this massive bohemian of a ship yet. That hasn't happened. So that's still something for the future. It's highly ambitious. And again, I just think it's interesting because the NASA astronauts from the space station haven't come back yet. And yet, here we are, we're talking about a brand new ship, much larger, much larger scale. And, he's already talking about doing it.
Wow. Okay. That's really good news. Now, not all the news has been so great, as you know. There have been riots. There have been a lot of protests, a lot of unrest around the country in previous weeks. I think if you're in a major city, you probably feel a little nervous right now. And you're about to feel a little more nervous because there's a new movement associated with the Black Lives Matter movement. Yes, that's it. Defund the police. If you've seen this hashtag on Twitter, if you've seen the memes on Facebook, if you've seen it on the news, on cable news, whatever you're getting your news from, this has been everywhere. The idea that we need to defund the police, and I think this is something where Republicans need to be a little better about passing the ideological Turing test. What I mean is, there's this idea in computer science, right? That can you write a computer program that will convince a human that the program is human? And so in politics, can you explain your opponent's position so well that your opponent thinks that you're one of them? Republicans usually are very good. We take in a lot of liberal media. We hear the other side a lot, and so we're usually pretty good as a group at understanding what the left is doing and what they're about, what they believe in. But right now, I think with defund the police, I've seen a lot of Republicans just sort of start bouncing off the walls, and they're so triggered by this that they don't even know what this movement is. And it is radical and it is scary. You do need to be worried. But some of the statements I've seen are just insane. Okay, I'll get to some of the insane statements in a little bit, but what this means, if you look at The Nation, The New Republic, left-wing publications that are advocating for this, and you read through what are they saying? What they're saying is we should have fewer police, and we should have more social workers, more mental health counselors. And of course, there's some problems with this, because first of all, if you have fewer police, right now we have a crisis where a lot of cities simply don't have enough police officers to control the amount of violence. Or I think you mentioned, Eric, last week that New York wasn't deploying all of its police. You had some police who weren't they weren't on the job, and Governor Cuomo was pushing Mayor de Blasio to be more forceful to use the police to their full capacity. But you have a lot of cities where
that was specifically something that that Cuomo criticized de Blasio over, was that he did not fully deploy the New York Police Department, which is in sharp contrast to what happened in Phoenix last Sunday, where they did deploy the entire police department, and there has been no unrest since then in Phoenix. I want to note that there has been no unrest in Phoenix since the Phoenix Police Department decided to deploy fully last Sunday night.
Yeah, there was a little bit of a scare last night where some kind of a construction site just went up in flames. People thought it was a bomb. I thought it was a bomb, but it turns out it was fine. It was just a fire, just an accident apparently. And yeah, the police have done a great job. There hasn't been a lot of unrest. There hasn't been looting. Things seem to be fine in Phoenix, Arizona, but there are a lot of cities where the police are overwhelmed. They don't have enough resources, and even if they do, just barely. And so saying that we're going to massively reduce the police force in the face of a huge crisis that could happen again just seems reckless. And also, Democrats need to ask what they really want. Do they want more neighborhood watch type groups? They didn't seem to like George Zimmerman very much. And we made this point on Twitter. I made this point on Twitter that the left went absolutely nuts. They were so furious after the George Zimmerman killing that, hey, he shouldn't be doing that. And, whether or not what he did was wise, I don't know that it was illegal. And if you don't have police, you're going to have a lot more George Zimmermans out there. And
no, I think one thing, Pete, that you have to mention here is, while you're talking about the fact that the Republicans don't seem to have a coherent response, I don't think the defund the police movement, if you will, hashtag, whatever you want to call it, I don't think it's well defined either. I think that's very clear. I don't know if you saw the interview that was done with the president of the Minneapolis City Council, because of course that's what's really ratcheted things up quite a bit when the city council met on Sunday, and they basically said that they were going to dismantle and they were going to disband the Minneapolis Police Department. Well, they did an interview on CNN, of all places, where the interviewer very plainly asked the president of the city council, well, what am I supposed to do if someone breaks into my house? And her answer was that it was a mindset of privilege that people were coming from, with the idea that you call 911 and a police officer will show up at your house. That's one of the stupidest things I've ever heard in my life. So the idea that even the Minneapolis City Council, this is the president of the city council who led this movement, the idea that she knows what she's doing, I'm sorry, it's not there. She has no plan. So what they're doing is, I think, they're playing politics, and they are trying to play to the crowd as much as they possibly can. And they're trying to also buy themselves some time. And so I don't think that they have a defined answer either. I did have an interesting article that I got from Police One, but it's an Associated Press article that I thought was interesting, because it talked about that this is not exactly unprecedented, because there have been police forces that have been disbanded in the recent past. And if you go a little bit farther, I think about Las Vegas. Las Vegas used to have its own city police force, and there was a county police force, and they basically disbanded the city police force, and now Las Vegas only has the sheriff's department. Even though it's called Las Vegas Metro, it's a sheriff's department. But in this particular article, which is an Associated Press article, but I found it on policeone.com. I like to bring up policeone.com because I know there are chiefs of police that read this thing. And this is where they get a lot of their news, and also a lot of their, their opinions and where they decide to go and all that kind of stuff when they read this stuff. And this article mentions in the fairly recent past, in 2012, it says, with crime rampant in Camden, New Jersey, the city disbanded its police department and replaced it with a new force that covered Camden County. That covered Camden County. Then Compton, California, they took the same step in 2000, and they shifted their policing to Los Angeles County. In other words, they went to the sheriff's department. So you have one instance in Camden, New Jersey, in 2012, where they basically just replaced their police department. And you have this other instance in Compton, California, where they basically just decided to use the sheriff. They decided to get rid of their city police department. And by the way, this happened in the Phoenix metro area too when I was a kid with the town of Guadalupe. The town of Guadalupe, which is a very small town, used to have its own small police department. My understanding as a kid, now I was a kid at the time, was that they were notoriously corrupt, and they ended up replacing it with the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. So a lot of this kind of stuff may not be what people are thinking. They think that there's going to be some sort of incredible radical change. And what you may have is simply the sheriff takes over, or you may have the state police take over. Those are also scenarios, because I'll tell you that woman, I don't know her name, but she's the president of the Minneapolis City Council. She had no clue what she was talking about. I mean, this to me was a complete emotional reaction, and she has no plan. That's the take that I had. She has no plan.
Yeah. Where I think this is coming from is I think this is coming from left-wing think tanks. I think that they push this issue, and then it gets filtered through, you have the protesters, and, people pick up on it, but they may not know what the think tank, they haven't read the white papers. They don't know what's going on. They're just repeating a slogan. And so you're right. It's the left isn't coherent on this either. Nobody is coherent. Everybody just reacting emotionally. I've seen reactions from Republicans saying, so wait a second, does that mean there'll be no laws? Laws don't go away just because there's nobody to enforce them. You could still have a citizen's arrest, which we saw with Ahmaud Arbery, where
which by the way, I don't think that they would encourage that. That's
No.
The other part of it that's, I think, laughable to me, is they would not be encouraging people to do citizen's arrest.
No,
and
absolutely not.
And do what you might term true community policing.
Yeah,
I've personally had an issue with the term community policing ever since I started my career. When I started in law enforcement in '98, we had community action teams, CAT teams. This was a very popular thing. It was popularized by Seattle. Seattle was the place that really started these community action teams. And what really upset me, even as a rookie officer, that stood out to me was community policing sounds like you have the community police itself, or at least you have an element of the community policing itself. Things like neighborhood watches, things like police auxiliaries. New York City actually has a huge police auxiliary of volunteers that help police the city. And there are other institutions like the posse. In Maricopa County, we used to have a posse that was second to none. Of course, Pence has dismantled that. To me, those are examples of community policing, but that's not what they were talking about.
Yeah,
community policing,
quiet on that.
But community policing in practice, the way I saw it, was the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And if you were yelling and there's that term Karen. We had a Karen in our city that I worked in, and every time she called, she got a response. And it was disgusting, in my particular opinion. She was highly racist. She was absolutely racist. Everybody knew she was a racist. And we responded to her all the time because she was, quote unquote, a community activist. And that's what happens with community policing in practice. It has very little to do with the community actually policing itself in any way, shape, or form. And I don't think Defund the Police has any intention to change that.
Right.
I think if anything, they want to make it worse, and they want community policing to be even more pandering to specific groups and specific whiners and complainers that, again, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's right, because I think the law should equally apply to everyone. I don't think it should just be because I'm yelling and screaming, you should do something. Sometimes, of course, you have to say, I'm not going to do anything because there's not a problem here. This is not a police matter. You got to walk away. Sometimes the best thing to do is nothing. And community policing is not about that. Community policing, at least as I was exposed to it, and I worked in a top 50 city, the way that I was exposed to it, it was all about these organizations and these people that whined and complained enough, and then you had to do something. And we had specific units that's what they did. And by the way, that went out of fashion after a while. The CAT teams went away. And then, of course, everybody went to the ComStat and the broken windows model, which came out of New York. You know what I mean? That's what Giuliani used to clean up New York City, was the broken windows model and ComStat, quote unquote, data-driven policing. So the model changed quite a bit. Now we're seeing community policing again. And I very much doubt that community policing has anything to do with the community actually policing itself and doing things like police auxiliaries, posses, neighborhood watches. You know, that's community policing. That's the community policing itself. I just don't see that happening.
Well, I mean, those are all very, very good points. Again, defund the police can mean a lot of things. It can mean anything from we're going to disband, we're going to let the state take over, which if you really do have a corruption problem, especially in a small town, it's hard to do with a large city, but especially in a small town like Guadalupe or something on that scale, yeah, you can have the county take over, you can have the city take or the state take over, and hopefully it's just a temporary measure while you reevaluate whatever the problem was that caused this to happen. You reevaluate, you rebuild, and you let the city get back to governing itself. You don't want to give up your autonomy, the ability of your citizens to govern themselves. If you really believe in not just limited government, but in the power of people to solve their own problems, which I think BLM should be on board for, and the defund the police should be on board for. Now, I know a lot of them are big government people, but if they're saying, hey, the police are pushing us around and we want community policing, that sounds like they want a bottom-up solution. But there's just a little bit of a contradiction there. That
I think there's a huge contradiction there, because I just don't believe that's what their end goal is. Yeah. Now, I personally believe Black Lives Matter as far as the formalized movement. I'm not talking about individuals who are protesting or individuals that use the hashtag or things like that. That's a wide scope of people, okay? Yes. And they come from all kinds of different persuasions. I've seen Trump supporters using Black Lives Matter. So, I mean, it comes from all angles. But there, as far as the leadership, and when you look into the formal groups, for instance, we have an active pastor in Phoenix, and he's part of one of the formal groups. When you look at their sort of manifesto and what they really want, it really comes down to a national police force. They want a national police force. That's really what they want.
Can you imagine the abuse that would come from a national police force?
Well, we have a great example south of the border with the federales. You know what I mean? And how effective they are, and how well regarded they are, right?
Yeah.
Because they're so well regarded.
And speaking of defund the police, the new president of Mexico, well, not so new now, but the current president of Mexico promised he was going to get rid of the national police, and everybody said, well, what are you going to have instead? He created the civil guard.
Yeah, he created a national guard, essentially. He created a sort of quasi paramilitary, it's very much like our National Guard in a lot of ways. And the irony, we touched on this before, the irony is he meant that force to combat the drug trade and to combat the drug dealers. Right. Mostly what it's been doing is actually enforcing the southern and northern borders of the country, because that was part of a compromise with Trump. And part of a negotiation between Trump and Mexico, where Trump was threatening to close the border, and Mexico basically said, "No, we'll enforce our border. You don't need to do this." And that's where those forces are. That's what those forces are doing. Instead of combating drug lords, they're maintaining the borders of Mexico.
Right. So, if you want my prediction of where this is all going, even if you defund the police, even if you disband the police, abolish them, you'll just replace them with something else that maybe it's not called police, but it'll be a bunch of guys with guns riding around in cars enforcing the law. So, yeah, I don't see how you get around that.
Well, I do see other possibilities. You know, there was a strange article that I read a couple weeks ago. I'd wanted to bring it up in a past broadcast, but we had so many other topics. There was this interesting event that happened in Alaska in a small town. I don't know if you heard about this, where basically they call them like village police officers because these are very small, isolated communities in Alaska. I never heard of this before. So these people are designated as peace officers, but they don't carry weapons. And what happened was there was an incident where a man with a rifle was basically shooting and threatening to kill people. And the village police officer ran away because he has no gun. And an armed citizen talked this person down and disarmed him. Now, that's kind of the model in some ways. I think that's what they want to go to. That's the practice of it. But again, I should correct myself. That's not what they want. That's not what they want. That, in practical terms, that's what would happen if you had a bunch of unarmed community officers or whatever you want to call them. They would run away every time that the situation was more than they can handle, and it would be up to armed citizens to deal with the situation. That's the practice of how something like that would work.
Yeah. Well, since COVID, a lot more Americans own guns, so maybe that's where we're headed.
That's called the Wild West. So, and we went through that period before, and we didn't like it so much.
Oh, well, we'll see. I'm a big fan of Wyatt Earp, but how about section? Let's move on. Section 230. This is an issue that we've addressed in the past, and there have been some recent developments on the issue. Now, this is the section of the law that governs when websites can be liable for the content they publish on their websites. And so there was an executive order by the president, by President Trump. And what's the latest wrinkle in the story, Eric?
So we did cover this in last week's episode. So I did want to do this sort of brief follow-up. This is a Washington Examiner article, and it says Trump's unexpected allies in the fight against Twitter and censorship, Facebook and the FCC. Now, we did cover that before. The executive order that Trump did regarding Section 230 obviously applied directly to the FCC. So that's no surprise to anyone, I don't think, who's followed this story in any regard. But what's interesting is this article talks about Zuckerberg's position in this whole situation is quite different than Twitter's position. And that basically, I don't know if I have the exact quote here. I wish I had a way to tab this. But basically, here it is. Zuckerberg said Facebook does not want to be, quote, an arbiter of truth. And I personally really like this. And the article mentions that, of course, Zuckerberg, being the head of Facebook and Twitter being a rival, it does make some business sense that Zuckerberg would want to have a position opposite of Twitter, where Twitter, of course, is adding these quote unquote fact-checking labels to certain politicians, including the president, while they're not doing it with others. Zuckerberg is saying, well, Facebook doesn't want to be involved in that game. They don't want to be an arbiter of truth. They want people to decide for themselves. And in this article, Zuckerberg is even quoted as saying, I don't agree with the president. I don't like a lot of what he says, but that doesn't mean I'm going to censor him. So I thought this is pretty interesting because on the one hand, you can be very cynical and say that Zuckerberg is only taking this position because Twitter is a rival and Twitter is a competitor. But I like this quote because I don't want social media platforms to be arbiters of truth. What do you think of that, Pete?
Well, what I would say is I am a little skeptical. Whenever you have these major regulations, they're going to affect different platforms differently. So I do think right now Zuckerberg anticipates that the repeal or the closing the enforcement I should say, expanding the enforcement and narrowing the scope of Section 230 would affect Twitter more than it would affect Facebook. That Twitter has, well, I don't know if you saw the Joe Rogan episode where Jack Dorsey and his head censor talked to Tim Pool and Joe Rogan and tried to defend the decisions they've made editorially of who they kick off the platform, who they allow to speak, who they censor, who they don't. And it was very clear that there was a left-leaning bias. Just even in the rules themselves, there was a left-leaning bias. Now, I think Facebook is less transparent about that, and they've come under less scrutiny. They've been attacked for fact checking and stuff like that. This is the first time that Twitter has done fact checking, and clearly the executive order was aimed at Twitter. Facebook has been doing fact checking for a while. It hasn't been nearly as controversial. We haven't seen the president responding this way. So I would imagine that Zuckerberg, for whatever reason, he believes that these regulations are not going to apply to Facebook, or at least it's not going to impact him as much. So I think he's expecting some kind of a benefit from all of this.
Well, the article does mention that Facebook actually does profit from ads by Donald Trump more so than Twitter does. So I'm not trying to say that there's no financial motive and there's no cynicism, but I do agree with the sentiment because I would like to see social media platforms be as neutral as possible, because that's what the word platform means to me. Platform means that it's a venue for you to discuss, just like a stage or a podium, the town square, or whatever it is. And we have to realize that for many people, these social media platforms are the equivalent of the public square. Mm-hmm. They really are in the modern age, especially when you think about the recent pandemic we had.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of the information about that, a lot of things that people were posting about COVID-19 especially, were being heavily censored. They were saying, this isn't true, this is dangerous, or this is misleading. Well, what's misleading? Is it misleading if it brings somebody to a different opinion than the censor has? Because that's just leading. It could just be leading. If that's the right opinion, and who's to say that the censor is right? Now, again, it's their platform. I think, it's a free country. They're allowed to do what they're going to do. But at the same time, there has been a question. Are these monopolies? Is this a public trust? And if these are a public trust, should they be treated as a public trust? Should we break them up? Should we subject them to further regulation, just like we've done to the phone companies? Where at one time the phones were heavily regulated, and then they were ultimately broken up because it was a monopoly. And you can't let one company have a stranglehold on the information that reaches the American people. And so, whatever the wisdom is of these moves, I think Twitter and Facebook are in dangerous territory. I would just bring up one other thing. After the 2008 crisis, the Democrats seemed to be pretty unanimous that repealing Glass-Steagall was a big mistake. That the separation of commercial and investment banking was a big mistake, and they were saying, see, that's a special favor for companies that we got rid of that regulation. But the reason that regulation was actually put in place was to mess over JP Morgan. JP Morgan was the only, what now JP Morgan Chase was the only major bank not to back FDR in the election. He backed Herbert Hoover instead. And that was the only bank to combine commercial and investment banking. And so, a lot of these goody two shoes regulations that are meant to that appear on the surface to protect the public are actually written to protect powerful interests. And so I have to believe, maybe I'm too much of a cynic, I have to believe that Zuckerberg is lobbying behind the scenes to regulate Twitter out of the way so that he can gain more market share.
That's interesting, because I have to say, if you look at the numbers, Facebook blows Twitter away. They're barely a significant competitor. It's almost like it's almost like some people talk about that they just keep Target around so that Walmart doesn't become a monopoly. I've heard that before, because when you look, it's kind of like Coke and Pepsi. There's a good analogy. Coke just blows Pepsi away. I mean, just absolutely has blown them away for decades and decades and decades. But Pepsi is still around. You know what I mean? And a lot of people, that they get sort of almost conspiratorial about it. Is the only reason they're still around is so Coca-Cola doesn't have to be declared a monopoly. You know what I mean? So that's why you keep competitors like that around. But I think that does segue good into one of the topics you want to talk about, which is the economy. I know you wanted to talk a lot about the economy.
Right. So I've been looking at the data. Well, we've talked about it in previous weeks, and looking at the BEA, the Bureau of Economic Analysis website over the past couple of days, I saw that savings are way up. Now, back in March, savings were 8.2%. Now that's pretty good. That means, they recommend, I think, 10% of your income at least should go into savings every month. In April, they're up to 12%. Okay, even better. That's up 65%, about 50%. So okay, so doing good. We're saving more money. People are starting to get a little worried that we're going to hit some turbulence here economically. So they're putting some money away to be ready for if I lose my job, if I'm having trouble making my car payment or my house payment. In April. I'm sorry. So that was February and March. Then the reports were issued in March and April. But the report for May, which is about the report in May, which is about the month of April, 33%. People are saving 33% of their income in the month of April, and that's the latest. That's from May 29th, when that was released. So that's huge. Now that money isn't just staying under people's mattresses. We call it savings, but what's actually happening, of course, is people are putting it into their bank accounts. They're putting it into investments. We've seen a big stock market rally this month, and I think a big reason for that is because people are putting that money away, and so it's shored up the stock market. We've seen the Dow Jones has recovered from its lows. It's up 50% since its low after the latest crash here. The Nasdaq and S&P are up 45%, and so all the major indexes are back to where they were before the crash.
And isn't that amazing, Pete? I mean, I think that's amazing. When I look at my own portfolio, I have a 457. I also dabble on E-Trader a little bit, and it's funny to look at those numbers because I took a severe hit when the pandemic started. I lost a lot of money. I haven't gained it back, but my personal portfolio has gone up quite a bit from its low. Okay. And it really, to me, in some ways, it's absolutely shocking to me because, here I am sitting here like, gosh, my neighborhood is literally burning down. We had riots in my neighborhood, and the stock market is going up. And it's interesting because you talk about people are saving more, and that's a pretty interesting, that I find that fascinating because that does explain to me a lot of why the market is able to rebound the way it is, because people are simply putting more money into it.
Right. Yeah, and personal income is up 10%. So if you look at the amount of personal income and you look at the drop in consumer spending, because there was a big drop in consumer spending. I don't think I have the number in front of me, but it was about 12%. And then you look at the difference between savings in April and savings in May. Well, there it goes. They spent less, they earned more, and they saved way more as a result. So, it checks out. The numbers are adding up there. We've seen, in the latest jobs report, 2.5 million jobs created. 2.5 million jobs created.
That was completely shocking to me. I think even on the show, we talked about this last week, that I was hoping and praying that the unemployment rate wouldn't go up, right. but it actually went down. I was amazed by that.
Yeah, a lot of people were, yeah, exactly. People were saying, has it bottomed out yet? How bad is this going to be? And then it turned out to be positive. In normal times, a gain of, say, 200, 300,000 jobs is a pretty big month. It's a good month for the economy. So 2.5 million is simply unprecedented. Unemployment went down from 14.6 to 13.1%. There was some talk about, well, is that really right? Because you still have people who are staying at home. But the fact is, we haven't counted those people who were staying at home in previous months as being unemployed. And so if we're going to be consistent, if these people who are temporarily furloughed, who are coming back to work in theory. We hope they're coming back to work, but they're staying at home because of the coronavirus. If they were not counted as unemployed before, they shouldn't be counted as unemployed now. That would be a mistake. But if you did count those people, then unemployment would be 16%. But that would mean that the drop in unemployment would be twice as large because you had a lot of, well, just like I said, jobs in general have been created. People are coming back to work and new jobs are being created. So people are finding new jobs. Finally, it seems like we have hit the bottom, at least for now. Um, Oil went crazy before all of this. If you remember, there was a time when oil was negative. You had oil tankers that they didn't know where to go because there was nobody to sell it to because nobody wanted it. People weren't driving. There was just no money in refining it. Uh, so a lot
Well,
of
I can attest because I do a commute at least once, well, twice a week, at least twice a week. I go from the East Valley of the Phoenix metro area to the West Valley, and yeah, the traffic is back. There's no relief in the rush hour traffic as there once was just a few weeks ago. There's a lot of cars on the road.
Well, it's not true everywhere. A lot of states are still shut down. But yeah, Arizona seems to have opened back up. A lot of states have opened back up, especially states with smaller populations, medium to low population states. But here's what Reuters said as of about a week ago. Shale oil fed a global glut. OPEC and allied producers supported prices by cutting output. If you remember, there was that whole fight between Russia and Saudi Arabia. But this year, Saudi Arabia and Russia briefly pumped more, and that was part of what precipitated the panic. Then fuel demand collapsed during the COVID-19 pandemic. Oil prices are about half of January's level, and many shale producers have shut down their wells. So we're seeing that supply is going down. We're seeing that demand is going back up. So we should see a rise in oil prices. Some of these businesses are going to go out of business, these oil companies, which means that you're going to see some people laid out of work. Look, lower oil prices are good for the economy. This isn't the whole economy. This isn't the whole story. But this is just one sector of the economy, and real estate is another. They say that real estate runs on jobs. A lot of people are out of work. So the question is, when PPE ends here, are people still going to be able to afford their mortgage? How's the real estate going to respond? What do you think about that, Eric?
Well, I found a good article that I shared on the official Liberty Starship Twitter feed, and let me bring it up here. This is from KJZZ, which is a radio station in the Phoenix metro area. And I'm sorry?
That's an NPR affiliate?
I don't know. I don't know that off the top of my head if they're affiliated with NPR or not.
Okay.
But what this article talks about is the housing market as it was in Arizona, in the state of Arizona. And it said Phoenix had a housing crisis before, and the pandemic could make it worse. And one of the things that you and I have talked about numerous times is that the pandemic has exposed fundamental problems in the economy that were there before and made them worse or made them come to light. And it says they have a story about this woman who lost her job and ended up having to live in her car, her personal story. But it says nearly 600,000 Arizonans have applied for unemployment insurance since late March. And it said the governor placed a moratorium on enforcement of some evictions through July, but rent is still due. And services like UMOM are seeing a dramatic rise in demand. Now, what's interesting here is this personal story of this particular family, I thought was really shocking to me, because again, I did think that in Arizona, evictions were placed on a moratorium. So I do question exactly how this happened to this particular person. But the wider point of this article is basically talking about how the Phoenix housing market has been going up for quite some time, and affordable housing is getting harder and harder to find in Arizona, which is interesting. I know you shared an article on the feed as well about San Francisco, where there's an opposite trend happening, and they attribute a lot of it to telecommuting, where you actually have places in San Francisco where the rent is actually going down. And many people attribute that to, again, the pandemic and the telecommuting that's going on. But this article basically is stating that before the pandemic happened, there had been this upward trend with housing costs in Arizona, because there is a shortage of supply. There simply is not enough housing to keep up with the increases in population. Obviously, Phoenix is a boom town. The Phoenix metro area has been growing and growing and growing. The state of Arizona has been growing and growing and growing. So right now, what they're trying to say in this article is that there has been a shortage of housing in Arizona for quite some time, and the pandemic has caused this problem to be highlighted even more.
Yeah, yeah, it's very strange times, because people are not buying houses in large numbers because they're uncertain what's going to happen. People are not selling their houses in large numbers because they're not sure what's going to happen. And so you have a big drop in supply, a big drop in demand. You've started to see the commercial real estate market pick up a little bit now that business is sort of getting back to normal. But in general, the market seems to be there's not a lot of volume. Not a lot of
Well, this
volume.
particular article is also concentrating on sort of affordable housing, like renters, not necessarily people that are actually buying houses or even necessarily renting houses, because you can sometimes renting a house is quite expensive, and you assume that apartment will be cheaper, right? That's not always the case. That's certainly not the case. I know that there, even in my own lifetime, there's apartments that I had that were much smaller than the townhouse I live in now, and that is financed and I make payments on, and my payments for financing are lower than my rent was. You know what I mean? For like a 2-bedroom apartment. That certainly does happen, but the lack of affordable housing is really what this article is about. Is that when you're talking about the typical working class person, they're getting phased out more and more in the Phoenix market.
Right. So the question is, what are city councils going to do? Are they going to start issuing more permits? Can they even convince builders to build more houses? It seems like there's a long-term downward trend in the number of housing starts nationwide. Phoenix, Arizona seems to have a lot of construction, but still there's a shortage. Why? What is wrong with the market? It seems like there's some sort of a disconnect there, and we'll keep monitoring this story. Now, you want to talk about the troop reduction in Europe, that the president has announced that we'll be reducing our presence in Germany.
Yes, that's correct.
Defund NATO.
Defund NATO. I wish we could get that hashtag going, because it's funny to me. So many people, in what I would call the liberty movement, as it is, or what's left of it even today. Certainly, so many libertarians, big L libertarians, small L libertarians, they very much are against war. They're very much against foreign entanglements and that kind of a thing. And it's just funny to me. It seems like Trump never gets any credit for the fact that he is trying to reduce our global footprint as far as the military is concerned, which I really applaud him on. And I don't see him get enough credit for it, especially from people who say they're for this. And I brought up this tweet because this is from, I would say, probably my favorite congressman, Thomas Massie. And he says, this is him basically going after Liz Cheney a little bit, which, by the way, anybody doesn't know about that, Liz Cheney was one of the people that really piled on Massie when he told Congress to actually do their job and actually show up and vote. That whole controversy where, Massie became like the most hated man in America for 24 hours. You know what I mean? When he demanded that Congress actually do their job and actually vote, because that was so controversial and terrible. The president went after him, but so did Liz Cheney. And so Liz Cheney, of course, blasted the president. There's an attached Hill article for this particular post where Cheney blasts Trump's move to draw down troops in Germany. She called it, quote, dangerously misguided. And Thomas Massie, Congressman Massie's response was, this is the same Liz Cheney who backed a candidate for Congress who advocated for a military coup against Donald Trump. Bringing many of our troops home from Germany is a great move by Trump. Germany and Europe can provide for their own defense. I agree with this sentiment 100%. And I agree with the sentiment of the president that Western European nations, wealthy Western European nations like Germany, should pay for their own defense. And it seems to me that this is a sort of no-brainer move to withdraw some of our troops from Germany. He's not even withdrawing all of them. He's still leaving, I think, over 25,000 troops in Germany. This is simply a reduction. And I just think it just shows, first of all, the tenacity of the so-called neocons and the fact that they just can't let go. That they can't conceive of any kind of troop reduction around the world. Any kind of idea of a less imperialistic United States of America. And then on the other side, you have the quote unquote liberty movement, the peace movement, and Trump never gets credit for anything. I don't know. What do you think about that, Pete?
Well, I was looking at Liz Cheney's record here. She hasn't been in Congress that long. She's already being talked about as somebody who has a bright future in the party. She's the third highest position in the GOP House leadership. That she's the chairman of the House Republican Conference, and you're right. This is the neocon wing of the Republican Party, which really hates the president. Even though I think he's been pretty even-handed on foreign policy, he's had people like John Bolton in his cabinet, but he's also had and Pompeo, who I don't know if you'd call him a neocon, but he's certainly not a peacenik by any stretch. So I don't know what they want from him. This is such a tempest in a teapot. Reducing the number of troops in Germany. Are we worried that the Russians are going to invade West Germany now? What's going on?
No, I think it's ridiculous, and of course that's in the Hill article. That's what they actually say. They say that this is just going to embolden Russia to what? To invade Germany? I mean, are you guys insane that the Russia's going to try to invade Germany? I'm sorry, folks, but that's only happened the other way around. Germany invaded Russia twice. Okay. And by the way, I want to make it very clear because I get upset about this. That's why I try to be even-handed. I get very upset because there's a lot of people on the liberty movement that defend Putin. I think at best an oligarch. You know what I mean? That's the best to say about him. At worst, he's essentially a dictator. And so the thing is, I don't want to defend him. I don't want to defend his aggression against places like Georgia, against Ukraine. Clearly, he has issues, and clearly there has to be some containment strategy when it comes to Russia and those kinds of moves. But the idea that he is going to invade Germany is ridiculous. Ridiculous. Obviously, is there a possibility of further, a further escalation in Ukraine? Absolutely. Absolutely. But Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Is there a legitimate concern about the Baltic republics being invaded by Russia? There is, because those countries are small and essentially defenseless. Germany is not a small country. It is not a poor country. They can pay for their own darn defense.
Yeah, yeah, I absolutely agree. And to speak to that a little bit, Russia has this habit that they've developed, the strategy of amplifying voices within the United States that are not necessarily that they believe will undermine American interests. So, for example, Adam Kokesh had a show. He's very far right. You would say he's a libertarian. He was running for the libertarian ticket, and essentially his platform was, "I'm going to come into office and I'm going to furlough every federal employee, and I'm basically going to abolish the federal government on day one." And so that's the kind of person that Putin likes to support when he's amplifying American voices, radical voices like that. And you have people on the left who are similar, sort of peacenik types. That is what Russia likes to promote. They don't want a strong national defense, but that doesn't mean that Germany, this whole thing is just nonsense. I don't this business of we need to protect. We still have troops in Poland. I haven't heard that Trump is talking about taking troops out of Poland.
Well, that's where the pragmatist in me comes in. I can see more of a need for troops in Poland. I can see Russia doing something with Poland. They did it before. They did it in World War II.
Border. Yeah.
Okay. They invaded Poland before. There's a historical precedent for that. And we've seen what they've done in Ukraine and Georgia. Hey, countries that border Russia are in a different situation, but not Germany. And again, my bigger point here too is Germany is a rich country. Germany is a G7 country. They have a large population. They have wealth. They can pay for their own darn defense and start building up their own military if they so choose. And if they don't, they should accept the consequences. Japan, in contrast, Japan has been rearming in because of the provocative moves by China. And we've encouraged that. And I personally encourage that because I believe Japan can pay for its own defense. You know what I mean? They are fully capable of defending themselves if they're given the opportunity and have the political will. If they don't, they're not a good ally. They're not a good ally if they're not going to pull their own weight.
Right. And let's say China did decide to invade Japan, which it's not going to happen tomorrow or next week. But let's say in a few years, something like that happens, say 10 years from now, 20 years from now. Is the United States then responsible for Japan's defense? Well, no. Japan is a very large economy. I believe it's the third largest economy in the world. They just doing the arithmetic, they need to chip in, just like our NATO allies need to chip in for their own defense. And that's been something that President Trump has pushed since the beginning.
And by the way, I think if you look at the military of Japan, which technically is a self-defense force, right. I mean, it puts Germany to shame. I mean, their defense force is state of the art. I mean, they basically have carriers. I mean, they call them helicopter destroyers or something like that. But they have, I think, the third largest carriers in the world. They rival the Chinese carriers. They absolutely are their mentality and their spending and their priorities. They're prepared. They're preparing. Germany isn't. Germany relies on us, and that's just not right. It's just not right.
Well, there's one related issue that I'd like to get to before we sign off here. We're running a little late, a little long here, but there's been a Republican revolt that's been brewing. We've seen a lot of the neocons, people like Liz Cheney, who have been less than complimentary of the president. And it seems like every day we've seen a new story about a former Trump ally turning on him. And it doesn't seem like a coincidence. It doesn't seem like this is just, well, boy, my conscience is telling me. This seems to me like this is planned. To have something in the New York Times, the Washington Post, every single day for the past week. It started with General Mattis. We all saw, I think, his comments. He wrote, "When I joined the military some 50 years ago, I swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Never did I dream that troops taking the same oath would be ordered under any circumstance to violate the constitutional rights of their fellow citizens, much less to provide a bizarre photo op for the elected commander-in-chief with military leadership standing alongside." Now, did have you been following that story, the Lafayette Square story, Eric?
Yes, I'm very aware of it, and I have a very strong opinion about it. So,
What's your strong opinion?
well, I basically take the position that it incenses me that no one cared that that this church was burned, literally that there these quote unquote peaceful protesters, and I'm sick of that. I'm sick of the media. You know what? The media doesn't have to tell me whether these people are peaceful or not. I can see with my own eyes whether they're peaceful or not. I can make that determination. You don't have to tell me whether they're peaceful or not. These people have desecrated numerous monuments that are symbols of the entire country, not symbols of one group, not symbols of one party, symbols of our entire nation. And then they desecrate this church, set fire to this church. And then the story is that Trump cleared the thugs, and yes, they're thugs as far as I'm concerned, desecrating a church. And then they're saying that this is bad because he took a picture in front of a church with the Bible. Because he took a picture in front of a church with a Bible. I really want people to think about that when it comes to this culture war that's going on. He's the bad guy, and even Mattis. I mean, I have a lot of respect for General Mattis. I know somebody that served under him and had nothing but good things to say about him. But this is just political crap as far as I'm concerned. These people needed to be cleared out. They were setting fires. I don't have any sympathy for them. I don't think you have to wait until they set a fire the next day when they set one last night to clear them out. And I think what Trump did, at least for my part, is a good thing, because we're living in this crazy age where you can't go to church, but you can burn down churches. I don't know any other way to put it. You can't go to church, but you can burn it down. It's ridiculous.
Now look, these protesters who were there that day, they weren't the same people who were there the night before who burned the church. It's a completely different crowd. I mean, unless you think that they camped out overnight, right?
No, I don't agree with that at all, Pete. Come on, don't be naive. It's a different crowd. Give me a break. These are the same people that show up every day. It's not exactly the same people, but the idea that this is an entirely different crowd, we have to treat them as if they're, that nothing happened last night. That's ridiculous. That's not what we did here in Arizona. We didn't say, oh, well, it was a different crowd last Sunday than the crowd that was pillaging the streets the day before. So we're just going to let them do whatever they want. No, we set up a curfew and we threw them out. We arrested the ones that wouldn't leave.
They weren't.
To me, it's not rocket science.
They weren't violating curfew.
You're talking about because we're kind of mixing things a little bit. You're talking about the DC protesters,
right? The DC there was a curfew in DC, but they weren't violating it.
Yeah, but my point is that they were committing acts of violence the night before, and I don't think you have to wait around until they start committing acts of violence. So, that's my overall point, and that's the only point I want to make. You do not have, if somebody is burning, if somebody comes out on your front lawn, and let's say burns a cross, because all of this is so racially charged, right? Somebody comes onto your lawn and burns a cross on your lawn, and then they run away, and then they come back the next day. You do not have to wait until they actually start burning the cross on your lawn again to get rid of them. You don't have to wait. You don't have to sit there and wait until they do something. That entire mentality to me is ridiculous. You have to be preemptive in these kinds of situations, because otherwise they get out of control very, very fast. That's my take on it. And
I haven't heard the Trump administration make any claims like that, or anybody. I haven't heard Bill Barr say that. I haven't heard anybody who's defending these actions make the claim that these protesters were somehow related to the people who burned the church. And I don't
think you have to make that claim. I think that's obvious. You're trying to say that these are like a brand new group of protesters, like they have nothing to do with the protesters that were there the previous night.
Yeah,
I do not believe that. I just don't believe that. I think that defies logic, because obviously a large amount of these people that come out are the same people. They're the same people that come out every night. I mean, that's just, to me, that's the way it is. That's what there. It's not like you get a brand new group every night. I mean, you're not getting a brand new group every night. You don't have to wait for them to get the gasoline and start making the fires. You know what they did last time. So you have to be preemptive in situations like that. That's my take.
Right.
I just don't think you have to wait for them to start burning the church down again before you have to do something.
Well, boy, that doesn't seem to match what the park police have said. The allegation that was made by Andy Biggs's spokesman, Dan Stefanski, I don't know if he's currently a spokesman, but he has been in the past, was that somebody threw a water bottle at a police officer, and that's what caused them to start firing tear gas, pepper balls, OC gas, CS gas at the protesters, flashbangs, things of that nature. The president has not been forthright about that. His subordinates, his spokespeople have not been forthright about that. They denied, and then as it was debunked, there were no apologies, there was no explanation. And there's not even a question of, what on earth was he doing? What statement was he trying to make? He walks across and he holds up a Bible in front of a church, upside down, by the way. But he holds up a Bible, and then what? What's the statement he's trying to make? He's not. To me, the symbolism rings very hollow. I don't know. I don't see.
Well,
that
if you don't want to
being
defend churches, Pete, I don't know what else I can say. I mean, I don't want to be too melodramatic about it, but I think the symbolism on the other side is very obvious, because we're literally living in this Twilight Zone world where you can shut down churches, and that's perfectly okay. By the way, I've made this point, and I don't know how many times I have to make this point. The First Amendment covers both freedom of religion and freedom of assembly. You don't get to choose one over the other. And I can't see a better contrast of the way that these things are spun than that entire issue, where him doing a picture in front of a church is awful, but the protesters burning it down, nobody cares. I mean, that's the way I felt the media coverage was. Like, who cares? Who cares? They have righteous indignation, so they can do that. But if I want to go to church, you should throw me in jail with your defunded police. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. None of this stuff makes any logical sense. How are you going to throw me in jail with your defunded police? You don't have any police anymore. So how are you going to throw me in jail for going to church? Right. Which, by the way, by the way, I guarantee you, I'll make this prediction. And I've said it before. Sometimes I hate to be right, but I'll make this prediction. The COVID narrative is going to come back. It's going to come back. It's going to come back with a vengeance, and they're going to blame. I've already seen this. I've already seen it from so-called medical professionals, the same people, by the way, who told you not to wear masks or buy masks, who now tell you you need to wear a mask. They're already starting it. You're going to see it. You're going to see this shift back to COVID, and it's going to be right back to it, and the need for the shutdowns, even in the midst of destroying police forces and dismantling them and all this idiocy. It is just incoherent garbage at this point. It's incoherent garbage, but you're going to see it. I'll make that prediction right now that you're going to see it. You are going to see that narrative come back about, oh my gosh, we need to shut everything down. These businesses, burn them down, burn down the churches, because you know what? They're causing COVID. It has nothing to do with the protests, nothing to do with them. Those people are masked up, which is very convenient that you're masked up for your protests where you're destroying property and looting things, which happened in my own neighborhood. So I do get emotional about it. And it's not an impersonal issue to me anymore when my neighborhood a mile away from me is looted and destroyed by a bunch of thugs. I don't have any sympathy for it. But I guarantee you that COVID narrative is going to come back, and they're going to blame Trump, and they're not going to blame the protests at all. The protests will be like a secondary discussion about this flare up of COVID everywhere. We're already seeing a surge in Arizona where they're talking about the ventilator use and things like that. So I can guarantee you the media is going to shift and go that direction pretty soon.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a big difference between protesters and rioters. You have a right to protest. You don't have a right to riot or to burn down any building, much less a church. So, fair enough. To get back to what we're talking about, a lot of Republicans have piled on. It seems like the Lafayette Square incident, certainly has divided this podcast. I think it was absolutely unforgivable. I think it was excessive. I think it was just completely unreasonable. And I think it was, they wanted. I think they went too fast. They could have waited 15 minutes. They could have gotten it done, but they didn't want to because they wanted the timing for the president's silly photo op. If he just planned a little bit better, 15 minutes, they would have had the legal authority to make the announcement, "Hey, it's curfew, get out of here," and they would have had the justification, but they just didn't at that time. And so Lisa Murkowski from Alaska has chimed in and said, "I thought Jerome Mattis's words were true and honest and necessary and overdue. I feel like perhaps we're getting to a point where we can be more honest with the concerns that we might hold internally," which I think says all you need to know about a lot of these Republicans, that they've publicly supported the president, but there's a lot of anger within the Republican Party. There are a lot of senators, a lot of congressmen who personally do not support the president, and we're going to see a wave of people coming out. Chuck Grassley, who's a longtime Republican, he's 85 years old now in the Senate, and he's been castigating the president on Twitter in interviews. He said, "Did you know that?" Well, specifically, he says he wants to hold up two nominees that the president has made for the director of national the director of the National Counterterrorism Center in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. So not the DNI director himself, but he's the director of the National Counterterrorism Center within the DNI, and Marshall Billingsley to be the Undersecretary of Arms Control at the State Department. Okay, now these aren't huge. Uh, these aren't huge appointments. I mean, it's not like these are ambassadors, these aren't cabinet members. These are fairly minor appointments. I don't know that the president's really. I don't think he would normally care if it were a Democrat holding it up. But the fact that it's a Republican, and that on subsequent days you have Mattis, Murkowski, um, and now Grassley, I think you're starting to see a trend where this is a coordinated effort. It's not coming out of nowhere. Here's what the president had to say about Murkowski. Says, "Few people know where they'll be in 2 years from now, but I do. In the great state of Alaska, which I love." Oh goodness, he's so corny. Campaigning against Senator Lisa Murkowski. Now, Senator Murkowski won a write-in campaign while still being named Murkowski. She ran a write-in campaign for a U.S. Senate seat. I don't know the last time that has happened. I mean, you had Nick Freitas in Virginia won a write-in campaign for state legislature, but honestly, I don't see the president. I don't see the president making much of an impact against her. I think that's exactly why she's making this comment. Is that a lot of Republicans since Lafayette Square are smelling blood in the water, and they're sensing the president's weakness, and she doesn't think the president is going to be around in 2 years to harm her in her reelection campaign. If she did, she wouldn't have said what she said. I mean, just go back to the words. He says, "Perhaps we are getting to a point where we can be more honest with the concerns that we might hold internally." Now, what does that mean? It means she's not afraid. It means she's looking at the polls. She sees that President Trump is down by about 8 points right now against Joe Biden, which is about where he was before the whole impeachment thing collapsed. Yeah, I think this is a real turning point. Now, there was the New York Times has tried to push the story a little too far. They've started just making up Republicans opposing Trump. One is President George W. Bush. That's not happening, at least not now. It's President Bush's spokesman, George W. Bush's spokesman, said this is completely made up. He is retired from professional politics, from presidential politics, and has not indicated how he will vote. And you were saying before we went on the air, he's probably not going to indicate how he's going to vote.
George W. has been very vocal in the fact that he does not believe that a former president should criticize a sitting president. He said that often about Obama. He was asked that directly about why he didn't criticize Obama more or say things about Obama. And he said, "Well, I just simply do not believe that a former president should criticize a current president. And we talked about that off the air. I think a big part of that is because he knows what it's like to face constant criticism of every single decision. It's very relevant because when you're talking about this quote unquote use of the military, it gets into the Insurrection Act. And there was a lot of talk about the Insurrection Act last week, which Trump never actually invoked. And there's that story about Katrina, where George W. talks about explicitly that his only option was to invoke the Insurrection Act in order to override the governor of Louisiana and also the mayor of New Orleans. That was his only option, and he knew he would be crucified if he had done that. And that's why he didn't do it. Just a little caveat to that. Interestingly enough, the last time the Insurrection Act was actually invoked was during the LA riots by George W. Bush's father. And that's a little bit of trivia for you because that didn't seem to be a big issue back then, but now it is.
Yeah. And if you go back further than that, it happens from time to time when you have a crisis like this. And in the case of California, Governor Pete Wilson asked basically for the president to do that. But in previous cases, like when Eisenhower called in the 101st Airborne to integrate schools in Arkansas, well, he didn't ask the governor because the governor would have said no.
Well, in that case, the mayor asked for it. That's also an interesting case study as well because it was the mayor of Little Rock that asked for help.
Yeah, but the governor had called out the National Guard to override the mayor's decision, and then the president overrode the governor. So, yeah, talk about a strange time. It's like the Toledo Wars when, just crazy.
Little Rock is a really interesting case study when it comes to that. It really is because, like I said, you had the governor in opposition to the federal government, to the federal mandate of Brown versus Board of Education, but the mayor called for help. And that was what Eisenhower used as justification for federalizing the National Guard and then basically making sure with the 101st Airborne that they did their job. With bayonets to their backs, by the way.
Wow, just amazing. Well, I think we could go on, but that's really all we have time for today. We're already running quite late. So, Eric, I want to thank you for another great show. If anybody is watching out there, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, subscribing, and we will see you next week. Until next week, I'm Pete Maines. I'm here with my co-host Eric Alexander, and until then, you keep flying free.